Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to tonight's event, the launch of Cara Blue Adams's story collection, You Never Get It Back. I'm just going to wait for everybody to sort of fill in the room, and then we'll get started. And if you're just joining us, if you feel like saying hi in the chat and letting us know where you're tuning in from, it's always really fun to see the geographical spread of our audience. And we'll get started in just a minute. Oh, cool. Great. We have Baltimore represented, Brooklyn, Savannah, Georgia, I imagine. Wow. Los Angeles, Denver, Minneapolis. How cool. Oh, Putney. I've spent some time in Putney, West Lafayette, Indiana. Wow, truly transnational audience tonight. Texas. This is awesome. So cool. This is one thing that I really appreciate about the virtual format. It's getting to invite people near and far. All right, and we'll just get started. Good evening, everyone, once again, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jean from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Cara Blue Adams, launching her new book, You Never Get It Back. They will be talking with Alexandra Kleeman, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Cara, to Alexandra, and to the team at University of Iowa Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up tonight. Although we're not able to host events in our store spaces just yet, our community of authors and readers is still here, and we're so grateful for your support. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which many of you have already made great use of, many of you have already made great use of, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat, which is a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question that you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You'll find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A module to be answered in the later part of tonight's program. And most importantly, the featured book tonight, You Never Get It Back, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, where you can purchase Cara's and many other books on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com if you are elsewhere in the country for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book. So make sure to enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online. Cara is also stopping by our store to sign copies of the book, so you can even get a signed or personalized book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request in order comments at checkout when ordering online by midnight tonight, or look for signed copies when you visit our store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And our interviewer tonight is Alexandra Kleeman, author of the novels Something New Under the Sun and You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, as well as the story collection Intonations. The winner of a Rome Prize, Berlin Prize, and the Bard Fiction Prize, her work has been published in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Harper's, The New York Times Magazine, and N+1, among others. She's an assistant professor at the New School and lives in Staten Island. Alex will be speaking tonight with our featured author, Cara Blue Adams. Cara's stories have appeared in many magazines, including Granta, The Kenyon Review, and American Short Fiction. Her essays, criticism, and interviews appear in The Believer, Tin House, and Plowshares. She has been awarded the Kenyon Review Short Fiction Prize, a Center for Fiction, Emerging Writers Fellowship, and accolades and support from numerous others. She's an associate professor of creative writing at Seton Hall University and lives in Brooklyn. Her new book, You Never Get It Back, won the 2021 John Simmons Short Fiction Award. In these poised and perceptive linked stories set in rural New England and across the country, including Maine, Virginia, and New Mexico, the power of place shines through the journey of a young woman in search of vocation and belonging, grappling with social class and privilege, gender, ambition, violence, and the distance between longing and having. Cara is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Alexandra and with all of you. Without further ado, please take it away, Cara and Alex.
Thank you so much, Jean, for that introduction. And thanks to Jean and Greenlight for hosting the event, and to Alex for being in conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm going to start by reading just for about 5 minutes. And I will be reading from the title story of the collection, You Never Get It Back, which is the second story in the book. And it's the first one where we meet Kate Bishop, who is the character around who all of the stories revolve. The story is set around this time of year. It's set right before and then on New Year's Eve, and it's set in 1999. So it's about to become the year 2000. And that seemed to me like a great place to start the book. So I'll read just about 5 minutes, and then Alexandra will join me and we'll be in conversation. You Never Get It Back. A party was being had, and Kate agreed to go. The party would be held in Cambridge, a 5-hour bus ride away from southern Vermont, where she was working part-time in a lab and living with her mother this first year out of college to save money and think about what kind of future she might want. It was a New Year's Eve party. With the arrival of a new millennium came a legitimate, historic feeling reason to panic or celebrate, depending on one's inclination. The whole world was gearing up. Her old college roommate, Esme, called to invite her on December 30th. And because Kate was fighting with her boyfriend, with whom she had planned to spend New Year's Eve, she said yes, though not without hesitation. But Esme begged. She didn't want to go alone. She promised Kate that this party would be fun and cheap and attended by Harvard Law School students, including Esme's ex-boyfriend, Paul. Kate and Esme could crash at his studio in the densely populated, Harvard-dominated neighborhood behind the law school if a better option failed to present itself. Both of us? It won't be awkward, Kate asked, and Esme assured Kate that she and Paul had a friendly relationship, but that each regarded the other with platonic affection and had moved on, going so far as to suggest perhaps, just maybe, if this other thing wasn't working out, Kate might be interested in him. No, Kate said, never going to happen. But Esme persisted, saying that Kate would like Paul. He had grown up in a single-parent household in a little town outside Albuquerque, lived in a trailer, was determined to rise from the lower middle class to the upper middle class. Some men in his position would want to be rich, Esme told her, but he's not greedy. He wants a nice life, that's all. Was Esme herself still interested in Paul? Kate couldn't tell. She made a non-committal noise. You're his type, Kate, Esme continued. Smart, brunette, with a working class background. I was too blonde for him. He called me princess. He hated that I grew up in a bedroom with white carpet. Kate arrived at South Station from Vermont before Esme's Amtrak train came in from the posh town in rural northern New Jersey where she had grown up. Esme was spending the winter holidays there with her parents, a VP at a pharmaceutical agency, and a real estate agent, who were both now semi-retired. Esme considered them her best friends. In her mind, they led audacious, iconoclastic lives. In the 80s, when my father was a lowly bench chemist, she would say, my mother out-earned him. They liked to drink and throw catered parties. Kate towed her luggage from the bus station through the chill wind of the concrete-walled outdoor walkway to South Station's main building, which housed the train station. Waiting in the train station's warm, brightly lit food court, Kate ordered a pepperoni slice from Sbarro and ate the slice with a plastic knife and fork to make it last. An hour to spend here at least, but she had been the one to suggest she wait. Go along to Cambridge when you arrive, Esme had said. Paul will be happy to see you. Kate wished she had a cell phone. If the train was delayed, how would she know? She would have to ask the desk agent. The big clock by the black arrivals board read 2:07 p.m. Esme's train was due in at 3:05. She read a back issue of Structure until 2:55 and went to the platform to stretch her legs. Outside, the sky was already darkening. A light snowfall drifted down from the flat gray vault, the wind picking up the dry flakes on the platform and eddying the snow in small twists like a peel of lemon in a cocktail. The pale light had a muffled quality, as if strained through white gauze. Would the party be fun? She gave it a 50-50 chance. A small regret moved through her. She would prefer to be in New York with Michael. But he hadn't called, and what could she have done? Gotten the ski resort's address from his mother and shown up unannounced? No, and anything was better than sitting home on New Year's Eve, worried and humiliated and preparing to break up with him unless he had a truly dazzling explanation for his behavior. 2 trains arrived on parallel tracks. Passengers disembarked into the cold air, stamping their feet and chafing their hands. Rumi, Esme's voice called from behind her. Esme liked to call her this, as if to reinforce the source of their unlikely bond. Their junior year at Williams, they'd roomed together, matched up by the housing office when Kate's freshman and sophomore year roommate transferred to Yale and Esme transferred in. Before going their separate ways, their senior year, Kate to a co-op and Esme to an off-campus apartment, they'd grown unexpectedly close. Kate listened to Esme's romantic worries and reassured her about her academic papers, which Esme gave to Kate to read, and after hearing her responses, relentlessly revised into perfection. Esme, in turn, took offense on Kate's behalf when she felt Kate had been slighted and insisted Kate stand up for herself when a professor failed her on an exam when she was in the infirmary with strep throat. She helped Kate with money, too. She had bought Kate's second semester school books on her parents' credit card, knowing the book's expense was a hardship and insisting her parents didn't mind when Kate tried to refuse what seemed too large a gift. And now, unlikely a pair though they stood greeting each other in South Station on the cusp of a new millennium. I'll stop there.
Oh my gosh. I'm glad you read from that story. I think it's a perfect introduction to the conversation we're going to have about this collection. I'm glad to see some clapping emojis over there. They don't make a sound in this format, but they do give some merriment. And I just want to say like a few words before we start that I first met Cara when she was the head waiter at Red Loaf, and I was but a young waiter trying to serve people and also do a workshop and also figure out who I was in that space. And I was struck, number one, by her ability to be so kind and also so wise and efficient and practical. But upon reading the full draft of this collection years later, as it was in manuscript form, I was struck by a second growing horror, which is how much did Cara notice about me while I was a waiter and didn't think I was really being watched, because these stories are full of so much sharp, perceptive detail. These things I feel like they dig right into the core of a character and the people who surround that character and give you these precious, touching, humane, humiliating sometimes, and very beautiful moments of character and essence. So I'm thrilled to be talking about this collection as a whole. And because you started with this title story, You Never Get It Back, I thought I'd point to this really wonderful moment in this story where Kate is remembering an English class that she took with Esme. And it's a class where they read Hills Like White Elephants, and this line comes up. The woman in Hills Like White Elephants, the Hemingway story, says, "You never get it back." And the male students in the class sort of ridicule that line. What's she complaining about? What's she lost? And it seems to me like, I think this is the technical term, like a very gutsy move to give your collection that title. So would you mind telling us a little bit about how you came upon that title and why you wanted to push it to the foreground?
Yes, I love that question. And I just want to say as we get started, it's just such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I remember first meeting you and just immediately thinking you were a person I wanted to be friends with. And then reading your fiction for the first time and just understanding how fascinating your mind is. And so this is such a special night for me. So the title of this story in the collection, You Never Get It Back. There are 5 things I want to say about this at once. So I'll organize my thinking a little bit. So I was thinking as I wrote the collection about a number of linked collections that I really love and story cycles as well. And of course, Hemingway famously wrote the Nick Adams stories, which are all stories that are about this character, Nick Adams, and his kind of coming of age and his adulthood. Some of which I love, some of which are not my favorite stories in the world, but some of them are really pretty extraordinary. And it's a pleasure, I think, to spend time with that character over time and to watch him change. Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son is another example of a linked collection I love, as is Olive Kittredge. Could go on and on, but I was thinking about Hemingway and the Nick Adams stories. And I was thinking about what it meant to put a young woman at the center of the story rather than a young man, and what coming of age means for a young woman, what it means to be in the world. So that was very much on my mind. And so those words, "You never get it back," felt like ones that were at the center of the book in a way. And in that moment in Hills Like White Elephants, of course, the young man is pressuring the young woman, we understand, to get an abortion. And she's saying that she'll go along with it to please him, but she's clearly unhappy about it. And she says, they once they take it away from you, you never get it back. The whole world, you never get it back. And she means, of course, this pregnancy, but also some sense of happiness, some sense of ease in the world, some sense of promise, which he has destroyed by making this request of her. And the story, my story, You Never Get It Back, really kind of revolves around that moment, I think, because it's also about hope and the ways that other people impose their wills and what that does to the way that you imagine the world. It has to do, I think, my story very much with power and with gender. And I think the book is very much about loss, about what we lose as we move through the world, which is, I think, a necessary process. As we grow up, we have to lose certain illusions. We have to lose people and places as we move through life and through time. But it's also about what is made, both what new forms we take, what we grow into. And then also I was thinking about loss as something that we spend time with in our mind. And I think the things that we lose and think about a great deal take on almost like a kind of ghostly presence in our lives. And that becomes a different kind of presence. And so for me, the title was maybe starting to capture a little bit of all of that.
That is a wonderful encapsulation of this whole collection. And I think that one of the things I loved so much about it is not just that it's an interlinked collection, which is one of my favorite forms and sort of a rare one. Like I feel like I can count on my 2 hands the interlinked collections that I've read. And I love the way that you use it to show both these moments of loss, but later on in Kate's life, I think also to show these moments of resilience, where something that was lost in a certain sense is not permanently and irrevocably lost. So I was wondering when you knew you were writing an interlinked short story collection and how Kate came to be at the center of it. Did she take on a life of her own, or was it something where you set out to explore and shine a light on different aspects of her character that you couldn't see from the first story?
I was writing and publishing stories for a long time before it became clear to me that that was the form the collection was going to take and that she would be at the center. I gave the collection a draft of it to readers maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And at that point, I'd written many stories, some fabulous, some realist, set many places. Some were very short, some were very long. And I was looking for what the thing would be that would make it into a satisfying book. So which stories would go in, which would not go in, and then what would hold it together. And I think as I looked over this kind of crazy range of stories I'd written, because I'd just been fascinated for years with the story form. I thought I was going to learn how to write a story and then I would move on to writing a novel in a year or two when I first started writing stories. And then I came to understand you could devote your entire life to exploring the story form. It can do so many things. And so that was really when one of my readers said, it would be interesting if some of these young women who were kind of similar either got to be more different from each other if you nudge them apart, or perhaps if they became the same character. And I thought, yes, that sounds really fun and really interesting, and I want to try it. And so I did some revision to make that happen. And then I started to write new stories as a sort of electricity formed. Started to see what characters could come back and who it would be fun to introduce to other people or put in conflict with in some way.
Yeah. Well, because one of the most interesting sort of cameo characters or supporting characters in this, I feel, is Esme, who appears in your title story as such a sort of in charge, or at least self-driven character, and then later on is still recognizable but has a curious sort of lostness to her. And I think like the most amazing thing about that transition was that I now saw her lostness not as a change in character, but as a change in the way Kate was able to perceive her. So it's these sort of like really ephemeral, really difficult to hold on to moments of growth and aging and subjectivity that I think you capture so well in this. And that I wonder if these sorts of phenomena can be captured especially well in linked short story format. So I mean, as an aficionado of the genre, do you think that there's something they can do that a novel can't do, or that a singular short story can't quite accomplish?
Yeah, I do. And I love that description. I think it's, it's really fun. Of course, a novel can be disjunctive. And I sometimes think it's interesting to think about fiction sort of on a spectrum from the most connected fiction to the most disjunctive fiction. But the story collection allows you to create a kind of constellation of moments. And those can be different moments in time. They can offer different perspectives. You can see the world through different characters' eyes or through the same character's eyes, but at different points in time, which allows some characters both to change and then also perhaps in some ways to remain the same, but for the person doing the perceiving to have changed and to see new things. And I love that quality. It's like a spotlight on specific moments. It's almost like there's a kind of dark crowd and the spotlight just picks out a couple of faces and puts them in conversation with each other. And so a novel would want typically more sort of connective tissue, more of a causal relationship between those different moments. And a story also has a kind of cohesion, it's kind of a singular arc. The story collection allows for something a little looser and more impressionistic, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it asks for the reader to do some of the work of moving around and measuring the distances themselves and comparing them to distances in their own life. Like I thought that this collection really draws a lot out of the reader in terms of how they've changed or how they view those events, or what of themselves they can see echoing in those events from younger Kate's life or older Kate's life. I guess I'm an older Kate now, but still. Well, I'm wondering too about the ways in which Kate borrows from elements of your own life and your own personality, and ways in which you've purposefully pushed her in another direction. For example, that for much of this collection, Kate is working in labs, and I wondered if you feel that there's a connection between the type of work that you do as a scientist in observing and analyzing, and the work that you do less empirically as a writer.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. I think it's so interesting to think about the artist and the scientist, side by side. And I liked that idea that as a scientist, exactly, she's observing, she's recording, she's asking questions about the world and trying to learn something about the world through almost like this sort of call and response. But it's a very kind of analytical approach. And when she becomes a writer, she thinks, well, maybe it will be somewhat similar. I'll be documenting and recording and being very precise and specific. But she comes to realize that you're asking a different kind of question about the world, or you're asking the question in a different way, and it requires something a little bit different of a person. And so there's a moment in time in which, she's felt that with science, she's been asking these very, very small questions, and they no longer feel like the right questions to ask. But then when she moves into being a writer and she's asking these much more amorphous and unanswerable questions, she also struggles with the limits of that sort of questioning.
It makes me think about a certain line that you have in this story that I really love, called Vision, in this collection, and it takes place at a artist residency that maybe this is just projected, but I feel I've been there, and I feel that maybe some other people in this Zoom room have been there too. But it follows our narrator in the first person this time, becoming acquainted with an older painter at this residency, sort of wanting to keep him at a distance, but then being kind of drawn into learning more about his work and having a friendship, a relationship with him. And as they get to know each other, they exchange a lot of thoughts about art. And one of the lines that I double underlined, and then will probably write down in my notebook, is a quote from the painter. "Remember, my dear," he said gently, "for the abstract expressionists, there were two things, action and hesitation, and only one was worth something." Which, throws me into an existential tailspin. which type am I? But I think that even though Kate makes some very active choices in her life, often they're outside of the bounds of the story. They've happened before the story, they happen after the story. And I'm wondering if you find value in hesitation as well as action in these stories.
I do, yeah. And I think that was bound up with my, not in any sort of didactic or explicit way, but as I thought about gender and social class and the way that we're conditioned, and also growing up in New England, which is its own very specific culture. I thought a lot about that question, action versus hesitation. And, something I remember being told in my early life as a writer in workshops was that our characters should, make big choices and decisions and take action. And there is something really pleasurable about spending time with a character like that, I think. And I wrote one story trying to take this advice to heart. And I thought, my characters, they're not making bold enough moves because I myself am not prone to these bold and sometimes kind of foolish or impulsive or moves. I'm someone who thinks carefully typically before I do something, and then occasionally I will just throw that away and make some sort of I have had my moments too. But I wrote a story in which this young woman makes like every decision I would not make. And as I was writing it, I just kept thinking, why is she doing these things? I brought it into a workshop and everyone said, why is she doing these things? I don't know, I would never do them, but you all wanted me to do this, I think. So that I had to sort of think, well, maybe I need to find my own way of thinking about action and hesitation. And, I think sometimes to decide to wait or decide to be silent about something, or right, there are actions, ways of making decisions, taking action that are smaller or more subtle. And I think I'm really interested in those sorts of actions, as well as sometimes in the, I also love a character like Esme who tends to go in and just make decisions and get things. That's super fun too. But I love the subtler kind of action too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you make a really good argument in these stories for uh, sometimes a hesitant reaction being its own form of action, because she's shifting the temporality of these decisions into a place where they will come to be made for her. Like I'm thinking of a certain possible engagement, or I'm thinking about, I hope there aren't spoilers in this because it is causal, but at some point in the book, there's a really wonderful sort of engagement proposal type situation. And in not responding right away and then like dwelling in her skepticism, Kate gives room for the person who asked her to sort of show more of himself in this like pressurized situation, and thereby like help the decision be made. But like I think it's true, or at least to me and maybe other writers in this Zoom room, that decisions don't get made just by an individual person. They sort of bloom from the whole situation at once. Maybe that's a cop out.
I love that way of thinking about decisions. I think that's exactly right. I think, sometimes when we talk about fiction, the language we use can obscure a little bit the fact that decisions are social. There's something we produce often together. And, you don't move through life just making decisions without material and outside pressures, without it being a social exchange. It's very, I love how you said that, Alex.
Yeah. I just wanted to throw some attention to in the chat. If you have any questions for Cara and I, type them into the Q&A module. I will see them, I will read them, and there are a million things to ask about, and I don't want to hog all the time. Also remember that you can buy Cara's book through the book buy link here at Greenlight, and it's such a great place to buy it from. I have to say I ordered a bunch of books and picked them up from the Lefferts Garden location this weekend, and it was so easy, and I got to look around, and I had a coffee in hand. So it's super convenient, and there will be signed books from Cara shortly. So because we're talking about being decisive and being all of these actiony, agency things, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your process finding your way through a story, because I noticed that in a lot of these stories, I was surprised by where they ended up. And I was surprised because where they ended was also a surprise to the protagonist, and I wondered whether you tend to start stories from a conclusion and outcome, from an initial starting situation, or whether you have the whole arc in place in some sense, and you find ways to build in these moments that make it feel very organic and lived and real.
Yeah. Because I wrote these stories over such a long stretch of time, I think I have tried everything there is to try in terms of how to arrive at the end, which Lori Moore sort of famously says that the story is an end-based form. If you get the end right, you don't really have a story. I think she's the one who says that a novel is a machine to make you keep reading. So readers might forgive you a little bit more with the novel if the ending doesn't have that sort of feeling of clicking into place in a way that's surprising and inevitable and opening up what came before it. But with a story, the ending just feels so important to me. And so I think when I was, starting out as a writer, I didn't know where a story would go. I always just felt like I was groping in the dark, and we got there or we didn't sometimes. And I've got a lot of drafts where I just could never figure out the ending. And then exactly as you said, the process is to go back and revise everything so it feels organic and surprising where the story ends up. But occasionally now, I think actually I understand the ending before I sit down to write the story. And sometimes I don't know how the story gets there, but I know where it ends instead. And some writers say they can't write that way because then the ending doesn't, if it doesn't surprise them when they get there, it won't be surprising to the reader. But for me, the surprise comes in how do they get from this first moment to this final moment.
Yeah, like reverse engineering a piece of machinery or something. Like it's partly analytical, but it's also intuitive too, and involves a lot of chance sort of discoveries along the way and mechanisms to slow you down or make something that you know is coming feel like a sudden peek around the corner. Oh, you know, I think this collection hangs together so beautifully and it's so intricately interconnected. But I also know that you write in many more styles, and we've done panels on experimental fiction, and I know that you write with a lot of humor and like satirical sharpness in some of your work. And one of my favorite stories by You Said Yes, the one in the Canyon Review, that's a really sharp Trump satire, comes to mind. And I wonder both how you figured out what the aesthetic bounds of this collection would be, and then how you let in these two marvelous flash fictions, the one that begins the collection and one that happens midway through, that are both like a paragraph or a page long, but are surreal, but also so in tune with the emotionality of this collection.
Yeah. Yes. So I love Kafka and Amy Bender, and I love to write those fabulous stories. And I love Lydia Davis and Amy Hempel and Ann Beattie. I love minimalism, but I also love, writers who write in a very kind of lush way. And I love Alice Munro and Elizabeth Stroud. And so as I was writing stories, yes, I wrote a number of fabulous stories and then a number of realist stories. And that was, I think, a reason it took me a while to work my way toward a collection, because I didn't just sort of find one thing that worked and then do a bunch of those stories. I kept trying totally different things. And I did try at some point to make myself write a whole collection of fabulous stories. Sort of, one attraction for me in terms of being a writer was that it lets you experiment and try different things and investigate different things. But I thought, okay, enough of that. Sit down, write a fabulous collection. And those stories for me, they either arrive or they don't. I found I couldn't. I've got all sorts of broken fabulous stories that they just started as an idea and they never became something more. And so when I sat down to put the collection together, I knew it would be a mixture, or it would just be realist stories. And I tried at first weaving in realist stories with fabulous stories and the kind of rhythm. And Rebecca Curtis does that, for example, in her collection, which I really love. There are some writers who work in both modes and they can set up a kind of rhythm in a collection, but I just found that the realist stories were speaking to each other so loudly that then the fabulous stories felt like interruptions.
Yeah.
And so that's when I reconceived of it.
But then the one in the middle, a metaphor, it just feels like a koan. It feels like a key to the whole thing in some way. And it has this, I think I put a little sticker in. It has this conversation between a couple, sort of, that like it's not quite a misunderstanding, but it's a deeper separateness between them, or something like that. And I felt that speaks to so many of the relationships that Kate goes through in the course of this book, that there are just two different ways of seeing the world, and sometimes they can be made to sit alongside each other and sometimes they can't quite.
Yeah, and that story as well, I think, is about the limits of language. It was fun to write. I'm glad that you feel that way about that story. I was not sure if it belonged in the collection for a while, but I finally felt that it belonged there. Maybe I'll read it since it's just a few sentences.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So this is the whole story. Metaphor. He said, "The house we argued in front of yesterday burned to the ground." She laughed, shook her head. It felt true. It felt like a metaphor for their entire relationship. "No," he said, "I mean it. Walk by. There's nothing there anymore." Which to me is so sad and funny and then sad. um, and yeah, you're right. It's a flash fiction story, so it's unlike the others in terms of length. It's not explicitly about Kate, but it might be, and it's very much about this moment of kind of miscommunication or seeing the world in ways that are adjacent but not actually sort of aligned, which is something she struggles with throughout the book with her romantic partners especially. And I think one thing she finally learns over the course of the book is that through hesitation and then finally voicing her worries or the ways in which she's not connecting with someone, to bring those worldviews a little bit more in line with each other, to be able to have a kind of greater intimacy, even if it also involves greater struggle in some ways. So I wanted to kind of smuggle this story in there.
Totally. And I think it also speaks to sort of a question for us as readers, like what does trauma or difficulty like encapsulated in literature mean to us in a literary dimension, and then what does it mean in a real world and lived dimension? Like, I think that one of the most interesting things about this collection is, for example, and You Never Get It Back, which turns into a story sort of a very unexpected sexual assault and infringement. Kate has an inner monologue that wants to sort of like reclaim the moment and just move on from it, package it up, and like lead off into the rest of her life with it all behind her. But the openness of ending on that moment is so vertiginous. Like I feel myself reeling, and it's one, like there's a long pause built into the collection there. I think like I had to put it down and like lie back and think for a while and digest.
Yeah, and that's something, I forget who said this, but some very smart writer said something about how, with a novel, often you finish a chapter and you immediately want to go to the next. But with a story, you need that silence and you need that space around what it is you've experienced. And so that for me was one of the pleasures of building a narrative out of stories. I hoped that readers would feel like, oh, I want to take a walk. I want to live with the story before I move to the next one.
Yeah. I have so much to say about your different endings, but I want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A or type them right into the chat if anyone has something. I see a hand up, and it's Cam's hand. But Cam, do you know your hand is up?
That is
okay. Okay. But if you type a question into Q&A, I will see it and I will deliver it promptly. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you too was that these stories feel so grounded in different places. I think there's some super beautiful descriptions of Arizona that really struck me, and then there are a lot of stories that take place also in Boston or passing through Boston, adjacent to Boston, or on places like York Beach in Maine. And I'm wondering, do places strongly affect what you notice and how you start thinking about telling a story? Or are your stories invoked or evoked by place?
Yeah, I think place is really important to my stories, but in a way that is a little hard to articulate. I think that, you know, until I left New England, I didn't really, it was tough to see what was interesting about it. It was tough to see it as a specific place, see it in a specificity. But I think often we see things through contrast. And so I could see Boston versus rural Vermont as very different places, but I didn't see the culture of New England or the geography as that interesting and specific. And then moving as I did then to Arizona and then to Louisiana, South Carolina, I moved around the country and lived in different climate zones and different places. I started to become really interested in the things that I couldn't see when I was there, but saw after I left. And I started to miss things that I hadn't even really seen or paid attention to in any conscious way, like just the amount of green that your eye receives in the Northeast. My eye felt sort of starved of color in the Southwest, and I would fly back and just watch the land get greener and greener and greener, and it just felt like a sort of full body relief. But then I came, you know, at first I was off put by the Southwest. It seemed like such a inhospitable place, such an alien place, that I couldn't really see its beauty for a while. I found it very off-putting. But then I really fell in love with it and started to see what was beautiful about it. And then when I left it, I really missed it and kind of craved that quality of light and the way the air smells in Arizona in the winter time. There's something called creosote, which just has this very beautiful smell.
That's my favorite thing. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I read in the 50s, people used to spray it with water before a garden party or something so that it would release its scent. And this was just a cool, snazzy thing you could do in the 50s.
Oh, I love it. What's
Or
holding us
today.
back?
I know, we don't have any around. But yeah, I thought it was so interesting how sometimes on York Beach, I think it was in this separate story where the temperature of the air was likened to the temperature of the air in Arizona on a particular kind of day. And so you're crossing these geographical locations that are so disparate, but in ways that we actually actively do in our everyday lives, because we're this like intersection of different places that we've lived and environments we've attached to.
Yeah, and that's one thing I love about consciousness is the way you can bring things together that aren't literally existing together, either through comparison or through memory, or I think metaphor is also a really interesting way to make something present that isn't actually there. So it's fun to think about everything that was accessible to the character and to build her consciousness through this range of places she's been.
Yeah. I have a number of questions here, and I want to start with one from Trevor. It's, how does the sequence of stories fit with the order in which you wrote them?
Oh yeah, that's such an interesting question. So the first story, which Alex referenced a little bit earlier, which is the one fabulous story in the collection, I Met Loss the other day. And that story I think of as sort of like a prologue to the book, and it imagines loss personified and needing to get a suit of clothes made from a tailor. And there are 3 note cards in that story, and I sort of imagine the 3 sections of the book as being a little bit like the 3 note cards in that first story. And that story was the second oldest in the collection, and it's the first one. I wrote that one when I was still working in Boston at a law firm, which was my first job out of college. I wrote it at first, I think at home in a notebook, and then maybe on my lunch break from work, the second half of the story just sort of arrived and I wrote it down, and I had no idea how hard story writing would be after that. That one was basically just sort of arrived somehow. And then from there, the second story, You Never Get It Back, is one of the more recent stories that I've written. And so certainly the stories, they don't move in strictly chronological order, although they kind of roughly move from Kate being, you know, in and just out of college through to her early 30s. But there's, you know, you can't sort of trace when the story was written based on where the story is in the collection.
There's something so interesting that happens, I think, after You Never Get It Back. We move back in time just just once sharply, which into like a moment in rural Vermont, which I think also speaks to Kate's feeling of class immobility or class mobility, and the way that a feeling of immobility is evoked by becoming mobile. And I think it's so poetic too, that ordering, and it's just a sequential thing too. I have one from Thea. Having spent so much time with the recurring characters in this book and really getting to know them, are you ready to move on, or are they still with you as you work on new projects?
Yeah, that's a question I've been asking myself. I definitely feel like these characters are still with me. And Esme, for example, the roommate, who's just so fun, she's what Charles Baxter called a Captain Happen character. The character who just like runs into a story and starts like making decisions and making things happen. I was thinking it could be fun to write more stories with her and Kate, because they counterpoint each other really nicely. They're not always necessarily in conflict, but they're so different that they push on each other in interesting ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I have a story or two I've been working on. One, in fact, I published, it's not in the book, but it was published in a journal about Kate and her sister Agnes when they're much younger. So yes, this might be a set of characters who are with me for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I love Kate and Agnes, and I love the idea of an Esme Kate sort of sequence, because they also do such a good job at sort of resolving conflict together, or like they sit and then they move past it, and that allows for these other different interesting shapes of conflict to come out. Excellent. Elaine writes, I haven't gotten a chance to read You Never Get It Back yet, but what I've always loved about some of Cara's other published stories is how she experiments with story form like epistolary structure. Did she feel the same freedom with form while putting together a novel and stories? Great question.
Yeah, oh, that makes me so happy. I love the epistolary form. And again, I think the story is just such a fascinating and capacious thing. It can do so many different things. And so definitely when I was putting together this collection, I was thinking about experimentation as well. All the different things that a story can do, and what a book can do that a story itself can't do, kind of playing with that. And it actually made it a little hard for me, I think, to finally publish the book, because in my mind there are like 8 other things that this book of stories could have been doing, which are all appealing in some different ways. And luckily I have great readers and friends who were like, I think you should pick one, publish a book, let go of it, and then you can do some different things in other books. But I love, Stuart Dieback has a great collection where he intersperses longer stories with flash fiction, and those stories are printed on gray paper instead of white paper, and there's this beautiful visual element to the sort of rhythm that he's setting up there. I think that's fascinating. I love Jesus's Son, which is sort of pared back in a kind of radical way. I love Olive Kittredge, in which we have stories from her husband's perspective as well as from her perspective, and then some townspeople's perspectives. I love unlinked collections that feel linked because the themes or the voice are so. And Alex, your own collection is fascinating because you group stories in an interesting way, and you do both fabulous stories and realist stories, but they all feel like they're coming from the same writer and consciousness. So that also excited me and made me think about experimentation to read your collection.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. I would love to see an epistolary take on some of this, or to jump around into some characters who can give a view on Kate. I don't mean to give you assignments, but there's part of me that, I'm so attached to Kate after this collection. I don't want her to disappear. Maybe she can be a supporting character in someone else's story, but she seems like someone I could know for a long time, if that makes sense. I have one more question. If you have any questions, please get them in the Q&A. From Rachel. You have so many poetic observations about everyday life in these stories. Do you keep a notebook to remember them as they come to you, or do you find they just tend to come to you organically as you write?
Oh, that's a great question too. There's a great Joan Didion essay, I think called On Keeping a Notebook. And she writes about that practice. And I sometimes give that to my students and actually talk about the notebook as a tool. And I like to sometimes get a bunch of different little notebooks and give them to let my students choose which notebook they would like to carry with them. I do try to carry just a tiny little cheap notebook with me where I can jot things down. I haven't been doing that recently, but I have been thinking that I want to go back to the practice because there are those things that lodge in your mind and stay with you. And certainly there are details that come back to me. Often I don't know where they come from exactly. But when I go back to those notebooks I've kept, there's such a wealth of these wonderful little moments or little bits of dialogue that I never in a million years would have remembered if I hadn't written them down. And so for me, to go back to that question of being an artist and a scientist, I do think there's something about observing and documenting the world that I find just really generative and really helpful.
I love that. And that was a question on my mind too, because some of these moments feel so specific, but they also seem so well suited to the story at that moment to give us a little push in a different direction or a moment of of breath or escape from the concerns that Kate is feeling at the time. So I couldn't tell if they were, found or manufactured, or I guess we're always doing a combination of the two.
Yeah, one thing I loved about putting together the party scene and You Never Get It Back in the title story is that I could take little moments from various parties I'd been to over the course of a number of years, or just funny or interesting or telling little, and put them all together into one, to me, very satisfying party scene. So I love that you can take the stuff of life and change it a little bit, juxtapose it, compress it, and then you end up with something that's just so satisfying and intense and rich and interesting.
I love that. And it is a great party scene. And, I've never been to a Harvard Law party, but I imagine this captures it pretty well. So if you're curious, do some tourism in that story. I'm going to turn it back over to Greenlight and just remind you that this book is so beautiful. It's a great one, I think, also for giving to people and then talking about these sorts of relational stories with mothers, sisters, and daughters, and relationships that travel through time. That's personally what I always like to give my mother, because then we share a little something that we can talk about in between, meals during these holidays. So turning it back over to Jean, and remember to follow the book link and support Greenlight Bookstore.
Thank you so much. That was such an amazing conversation. I learned so much from listening to both of you, and there were such great questions. Thank you everyone for attending tonight's event, and don't forget to buy your copy of You Never Get It Back, and don't forget to use the coupon code for a 10% discount. Thank you so much. Check out our upcoming virtual events and stay tuned for our January events later this week. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks so much for coming. It's good to see you, Cara.
Good to see you, Alex.